The dog growled at the child every night. When the father found out why, he was horrified. A story that will leave you speechless. What happens in the middle completely changes the ending. We'd love to know which city you're watching this video from, so let us know in the comments. While you're at it, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with all our content. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as James stretched by the kitchen window, watching the golden sunrise over the rolling fields. The small house they called home sat on the outskirts of Fairfield, a sleepy town where life moved at a pace slow enough for them to savor its simplicity. Inside the house, the sound of baby Oliver's cooing floated through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable pitter-patter of paws. Storm was already on duty. Storm, a majestic German shepherd with an unwavering loyalty to his family, padded into Oliver's room. He settled next to the crib, his head resting on his paws but his eyes alert. James couldn't help but smile. Since the day Storm entered their lives, he had been more than just a pet. He was a protector, a constant companion, and, most recently, Oliver's self-appointed guardian. Margaret joined James in the kitchen, still tying the belt of her robe. Her eyes lit up at the sight of him. "Storm's already with Oliver," she said with a grin. "Sometimes I think he loves that baby more than we do." James chuckled, pulling her into a one-armed hug. "I don't mind sharing. He's doing a better job keeping an eye on Oliver than I ever could." Their peaceful routine continued until 2 weeks ago, when Storm's behavior began to shift. It was subtle at first, an uneasy growl here, a rigid posture there. But as the days wore on, it became impossible to ignore. Each night, without fail, Storm stationed himself beside Oliver's crib, his body tense and his gaze fixed on the same corner of the room. His low growls would rumble like distant thunder, sending shivers down Margaret's spine. "It's probably just his instincts," James had reassured her at first. "Maybe he's hearing something we can't, like mice in the walls." But Margaret wasn't convinced. "James, what if it's more than that? What if he senses something dangerous?" Their small-town life had never required them to think in terms of danger. Fairfield was the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked and your windows open. Yet, Storm's uncharacteristic vigilance planted a seed of doubt in Margaret's mind. They decided to investigate. James scoured Oliver's room for any sign of pests or drafts, while Margaret reached out to their veterinarian. The vet had assured them Storm was perfectly healthy, dismissing his behavior as overprotectiveness. But the tension in the house only grew. It was during one of those nightly vigils that James noticed the mobile above Oliver's crib swaying gently, though the windows were closed. He leaned closer, holding his breath as he felt a faint chill brush past his skin. "What is it?" Margaret asked from the doorway, startling him. "I don't know," James said, frowning. "It's like there's a draft, but I can't tell where it's coming from." Storm's growl deepened, his ears flattening as his gaze remained locked on the corner. For the first time, James felt a twinge of unease. Whatever was causing Storm's distress wasn't visible to the naked eye. James didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling while Margaret's soft breaths filled the room beside him. Down the hall, he could hear Storm's occasional growl punctuate the stillness. The corner of Oliver's room had become the source of all his unease. At 3 a.m., unable to shake the growing discomfort, James slipped out of bed and padded quietly toward the nursery. Storm was in his usual spot, his muscular frame coiled like a spring, ears alert. James crouched beside him, placing a hand on his warm fur. "What is it, boy?" James whispered. "What are you protecting him from?" Storm responded with a low whine, his gaze never wavering from the corner. James followed his line of sight but saw only shadows cast by the dim nightlight shaped like a teddy bear. Yet, standing there in the silence, James couldn't deny the odd sensation creeping over him, a feeling like he was being watched. The next morning, James and Margaret decided to act. "I'm calling an inspector," James announced as they sat over breakfast. Oliver babbled in his high chair while Storm sat close by, watching over him as usual. "Do you think it's structural?" Margaret asked, stirring her tea nervously. "I don't know," James admitted. "But something's causing that draft, and I'm not going to ignore it anymore." The inspector, a wiry man named Todd with years of experience under his belt, arrived the same afternoon. He was thorough, scanning the walls, checking the windows, and even venturing into the crawl space beneath the house. "Everything looks solid," Todd said as he emerged from the nursery. "No cracks, no signs of rodents, and no issues with insulation." James frowned, exchanging a glance with Margaret. "What about the draft?" "The one in Oliver's room." Todd shrugged. "Could be an air pocket from somewhere I missed. Old houses like this are full of quirks. But structurally, you're fine." The explanation didn't sit well with James. That night, he set up a baby monitor with a camera pointed directly at the crib. "If Storm's seeing something we can't," James told Margaret, "this will catch it." Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled as she adjusted Oliver's blanket. "I just want this to stop. I want to feel safe again." The video the first night yielded nothing. James reviewed the footage over his morning coffee, watching as Oliver slept peacefully while Storm maintained his usual vigil. On the second night, something changed. James fast-forwarded through the footage, his eyes scanning the screen for any movement. When the timestamp hit 2:47 a.m., his hand froze. There was a flicker in the corner. It was subtle, like the distortion you might see in a heatwave, but it was enough to make James' pulse quicken. He rewound the footage and played it again, leaning closer to the screen. "James?" Margaret's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, holding Oliver. "There's something here," James said, gesturing for her to come closer. Margaret set Oliver in his playpen and joined him at the table. Together, they watched the footage as the flicker appeared again, a ripple in the shadows, just for a moment, before vanishing. What is that?" Margaret whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't know," James admitted. "But I'm going to find out." Storm, as if sensing their unease, let out a sharp bark. Both James and Margaret turned to see the dog standing by Oliver's playpen, his body tense and his ears flat. "He knows something," Margaret murmured. The discovery by the following evening, James had devised a plan. He borrowed a thermal imaging camera from a friend at the hardware store, determined to uncover the source of the strange phenomenon. As the clock struck midnight, James crept into Oliver's room, camera in hand. Storm followed close behind, his growls barely audible. James aimed the thermal camera at the corner. At first, the screen showed only the expected colors, blues and greens for the cooler surfaces. But as he adjusted the angle, a burst of red flared on the screen. "What the?" James muttered, moving closer. The red area pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. Storm barked suddenly, startling James. The dog lunged toward the corner, his teeth bared and a snarl ripping from his throat. James stumbled backward, dropping the camera as a loud thud echoed through the room. Margaret rushed in, Oliver in her arms. "James! What's going on?" Before he could answer, a chilling sound filled the air, a faint, echoing whisper, as if carried on the wind. The room seemed to grow colder, and Oliver began to cry. Storm didn't back down. He stood firm, his barks fierce and unrelenting as the shadows in the corner seemed to ripple once more. James grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her back into the hallway. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice trembling. The air outside was sharp and cold, biting against James's skin as he loaded Oliver into the car. Margaret followed close behind, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. Storm jumped into the back seat without hesitation, his head swiveling between the house and the baby as if unwilling to let either out of his sight. The family sped down the empty country road toward Margaret's sister's house, their temporary refuge for the night. The baby's cries filled the car, mingling with Storm's uneasy whimpers. "James," Margaret finally said, her voice trembling, "what was that? What was that thing in the corner?" "I don't know," James admitted, gripping the wheel tightly. "But whatever it is, it's not safe for Oliver. I'm not taking any chances." When they arrived at Margaret's sister Rebecca's home, the warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the chill they had left behind. Rebecca greeted them in her pajamas, her face etched with concern as Margaret quickly explained the situation. "You think your house is haunted?" Rebecca asked, raising an eyebrow. James shook his head. "I don't know what to think. But I'm going to figure it out." Research and the forgotten history. The next morning, while Margaret and Rebecca kept Oliver occupied, James sat in the dining room with his laptop open. Storm lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch the door as though expecting trouble to follow them. James searched for hours, typing variations of cold spots, shadow figures, and paranormal activity. Much of what he found seemed like sensational nonsense, but one article caught his eye: Unseen Threats, How Animals Sense Danger Before Humans Do. The article detailed various accounts of dogs detecting fires, earthquakes, and even illnesses before their owners. But one section stood out: a story about a family dog who had relentlessly growled at a specific area in their home. It turned out that the house was built over an old burial site, and disturbances in the soil had caused unsettling activity. James froze, the gears in his mind turning. Could their home's history hold the key? He pulled up property records and local archives, diving into the past of their land. It didn't take long to uncover something chilling. Their house sat on what had once been a settlement in the 1800s. Fairfield had been a prosperous mining town back then, but a collapse in one of the mines had killed dozens of workers. The land had been sold and repurposed over the years, with the tragedy mostly forgotten. James leaned back in his chair, his pulse racing. Could this explain the strange occurrences? Could those who had perished in the mine still be lingering? Storm let out a soft growl, his ears twitching. James glanced down and saw the dog staring toward the front door. A warning from the past. That evening, James shared his findings with Margaret. "Our house might be built on part of that old mining settlement," he said. "Maybe there's something left behind, something we disturbed without knowing." Margaret's face turned pale. "What are you saying, James? That this is, what? A haunting?" "I don't know. But it can't be a coincidence," he said. "Storm's been acting like this for weeks, and now we've got cold spots, moving shadows, and that whisper." Rebecca, listening from the couch, chimed in. "If this is really about the mine, maybe you should talk to someone who knows more about it. There's a historian in town who specializes in Fairfield's history. Dr. Eleanor Green. She works at the library." The next day, James and Margaret visited the library while Rebecca stayed home with Oliver. The sprawling building was nearly empty, and the smell of old books filled the air. Dr. Green, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile, greeted them warmly. When James explained what they were looking for, her expression turned serious. "Ah, the mines," she said, nodding. "Many people don't realize how much tragedy this town has seen. The collapse in 1874 claimed 42 lives. Some bodies were never recovered." Margaret shuddered. "Do you think their spirits could still be here?" Dr. Green hesitated. "I'm not one for superstition, but I will say this: history leaves echoes. Trauma, loss, and pain can imprint themselves on a place. If you're experiencing something unusual, it may be worth investigating further. She handed James an old map of the settlement. Here. This shows the layout before the mines were shut down. If your house is near the site of the collapse, it could explain the activity you're describing. James thanked her and quickly studied the map. His heart sank as he recognized the outline of their property. The corner of the nursery was directly above the collapsed mine shaft. The medium desperate for answers, Margaret suggested one final step, contacting a medium. Though skeptical, James agreed. They found a local woman named Clara, a calm, no-nonsense professional who claimed to have helped others in similar situations. When Clara entered the house that evening, Storm bristled at first but quickly settled, as if recognizing her intentions. Clara walked through the room silently, pausing often and closing her eyes. When she reached Oliver's nursery, she froze. "This is it," she said softly. "There's a presence here. It's not malevolent, but it's restless." Margaret clutched James's arm. "What does it want?" Clara placed a hand on the wall, her face etched with concentration. "It's searching. Something was taken from this place, a piece of them. They want it returned." "Taken?" James asked. Clara nodded. "Something small. A token, a memory. It's tied to the mine." Storm let out a bark, startling them. He stood by the crib, his tail wagging slightly, as if urging them to act. Clara's words echoed in James's mind long after she left the house. Something was taken from this place, a piece of them. They want it returned. But what could it be? The nursery was newly renovated before Oliver was born, and James had personally torn out the old carpeting and baseboards. If something had been hidden in the house, wouldn't he have noticed? Storm paced restlessly that night, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. James sat on the couch, map in hand, tracing the outline of their house and its connection to the old mine. "It's got to be here somewhere," he muttered, glancing toward Margaret, who sat beside him, holding a sleeping Oliver. "What if it's buried?" Margaret whispered. "If it's connected to the mine, maybe it's not inside the house. Maybe it's underneath." James looked at her, realization dawning. The crawl space. The next morning, while Margaret stayed with Rebecca and Oliver, James prepared to explore the crawl space beneath the house. Storm refused to leave his side, watching intently as James donned gloves and grabbed a flashlight. The opening to the crawl space was in the backyard, hidden behind an old shrub. James pulled the panel aside and shone his flashlight into the narrow, dusty void. The air smelled of damp earth, and cobwebs hung like curtains. "Stay here, boy," James said, but Storm ignored him, slipping into the space ahead. "Of course you're coming," James muttered, crawling in after him. The space was cramped, and James had to duck his head to avoid hitting the beams. As he moved further in, he noticed something odd. One section of the ground looked disturbed, the dirt looser and darker than the surrounding area. James knelt down, his hands trembling as he began to dig. The soil was cool and gave way easily, revealing something hard beneath. "Storm," James whispered, as if the dog could understand the weight of the moment. "I think I found it." He unearthed a small wooden box, no larger than a shoebox. The lid was warped with age, and the wood felt fragile under his fingers. James carefully pried it open, revealing its contents: a tarnished pocket watch, a photograph of a young man in a miner's uniform, and a folded piece of yellowed paper. Storm let out a low whine, his nose nudging the box. James unfolded the paper, his heart pounding as he read the scrawled handwriting: "To my dearest Anna, I will return to you soon. Until then, keep this safe for me. All my love, E." The watch and photograph must have belonged to one of the miners who perished in the collapse. Had he hidden the box here before the disaster? And why had no one found it until now? The confrontation that night, James called Clara to share what he had found. "I think this is what they've been looking for," he said. Clara agreed to come back the next evening to help make things right, as she put it. But before Clara arrived, the house's energy shifted. The draft in Oliver's room grew colder, the shadows darker. Storm barked furiously, pacing between the nursery and the living room as if trying to warn them of something imminent. When Clara arrived, she immediately noticed the change. "They know you found it," she said. "They're waiting for you to return it." "What do we do?" Margaret asked, clutching Oliver tightly. Clara led them to the nursery, where the shadows in the corner seemed to ripple like waves on a dark ocean. She instructed James to place the box in the center of the room. "Speak to them," Clara said. "Acknowledge their loss. Tell them this belongs to them, and that it's time for them to move on." James hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. He wasn't sure if he believed in ghosts, but the heaviness in the room made it impossible to doubt that something was there. He knelt beside the box, his voice steady but quiet. "To whoever this belongs to, I'm sorry for what happened to you. I hope this can bring you peace. We'll keep your memory alive." The room grew still, the draft ceasing. Storm stood beside James, his ears perked and his body calm for the first time in weeks. Then, as if carried on the wind, a faint voice whispered, "Thank you." A new beginning. Over the next few days, the house returned to normal. The cold spots were gone, the shadows no longer rippled, and Storm stopped growling at the nursery. Oliver slept peacefully in his crib, with Storm now lying contentedly at the foot of the bed instead of standing guard. James and Margaret buried the box in a quiet spot near the old mining site, marking it with a small wooden cross. They felt it was the least they could do to honor the life that had been lost and the memory that had lingered. Weeks later, as they sat on the porch watching Oliver toddle on the grass with Storm by his side, James turned to Margaret. "Do you think they're at peace now?" he asked. Margaret smiled softly. "I think so. And I think Storm knew exactly what to do all along." Storm barked once, wagging his tail as if in agreement. The days after the burial of the box brought a newfound sense of peace to the household. Oliver's nursery felt warm again, and Storm returned to his playful self, no longer anxious or alert in the dead of night. James and Margaret began to believe the ordeal was behind them. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as James prepared to lock up for the night, he noticed Storm standing by the front door, growling low. The dog's body was tense, his gaze fixed on something outside. "Not again," James muttered, peering out the window. The yard was empty. That night, James stayed awake, monitoring the house. At precisely 2:47 a.m., the same time he had seen the flicker in the video, he heard it, faint footsteps echoing from the crawl space beneath the house. Chapter 6, The Second Presence. James didn't tell Margaret about the footsteps. He didn't want to alarm her, especially with how much calmer things had seemed since the burial. But the sounds persisted, growing louder each night. Determined to uncover the truth, James returned to the crawl space alone, armed with a flashlight and Storm at his side. As he moved toward the spot where he'd found the box, he noticed something new, another patch of disturbed dirt. His pulse quickened as he began to dig. This time, he unearthed something much larger, a rusted metal chest, sealed shut. James pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a chilling sight, human bones, wrapped in decayed fabric. Among them was a miner's helmet, its surface scratched as though the wearer had tried desperately to claw their way out of something. Storm let out a sharp bark, his tail low and his body rigid. The temperature around James plummeted, and he felt a presence behind him. A whisper broke the silence. "Why did you leave me?" The morning after James unearthed the chest containing the skeletal remains, the atmosphere in the house felt thick with unease. Margaret immediately noticed the tension in James's face as he sat in the kitchen, staring at the chest, which now rested on the table. Storm lay beside him, uncharacteristically quiet, his gaze fixed on the object. "What's in it?" Margaret asked, her voice a mixture of curiosity and fear. James hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were human bones, their once white surfaces now yellowed with age and marked by the passage of time. Among them was a miner's helmet, dented and scratched as though it had been subjected to immense pressure. Margaret gasped, stepping back, her hands instinctively moving to cover her mouth. "There's more," James said, his voice low. He carefully removed the helmet, revealing a collection of items beneath it, a broken pickaxe, a rusted tin cup, and a crumpled piece of cloth that appeared to have been part of a uniform. The sight was haunting, but it was the scratches on the inside of the helmet that sent a chill down James's spine. The marks were deep and jagged, as though the miner had clawed at it in desperation. What does this mean?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. James shook his head. "I don't know. But I don't think this is the same spirit we dealt with before. This feels different. Angrier." Storm let out a low growl, his ears flattening. He stood and began pacing, his body tense and alert. Later that afternoon, James contacted Clara, the medium, who arrived at the house within the hour. She immediately recognized the shift in the home's energy. "This isn't residual energy," she said after studying the chest. "This is an intelligent presence, one that's fully aware of its surroundings. And it's angry." "Angry about what?" Margaret asked, clutching Oliver protectively. Clara examined the chest and its contents with care. Her fingers hovered over the bones, her face growing solemn. "This person died in great suffering. The scratches on the helmet, they tell me he was trapped. Alone. Forgotten." James felt a lump in his throat. "Forgotten." Clara nodded. "Imagine the despair of dying that way, abandoned in darkness. And then, for your remains to sit here, undiscovered, for over a century. No closure, no recognition. The spirit attached to these bones feels betrayed, not just by the world, but by the other miners who survived and left him behind." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "How do we help him?" Clara paused, her expression grave. "You need to acknowledge his pain. But more than that, you need to ensure his story is remembered. Spirits like this don't just want release, they want justice for what happened to them. They want to be seen." James and Clara spent the rest of the day examining the remains and the items in the chest, trying to piece together the miner's story. The helmet bore the initials JR, and the fabric seemed to match the uniform of the Fairfield Mining Company. James remembered the historian, Dr. Green, and decided to reach out to her again. Over the phone, she provided additional records, including a list of miners who had perished in the 1874 collapse. "JR," James muttered, scanning the list. His eyes stopped on one name, Jonas Rutherford. Jonas was one of the men who was never recovered, Dr. Green explained. His family petitioned for weeks to have the mine reopened so they could find him, but the company refused. They deemed it too dangerous. Margaret's face fell. "They just left him there." "Yes," Dr. Green said. "And he wasn't the only one. Over a dozen men were left behind when the mine was sealed." James felt a mix of anger and sorrow welling up inside him. He couldn't imagine the terror Jonas must have felt in his final moments, buried alive, scratching at his helmet in desperation. Storm barked sharply, breaking the somber silence. His tail was stiff, his eyes locked on the nursery door. "He knows," Clara said quietly. "The spirit knows you've discovered his name. He's waiting for you to do something about it. That night, as James prepared to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air in the house was heavy again, and faint whispers seemed to emanate from the walls. Storm sat at the foot of the bed, staring at the door with unblinking focus. At 2:47 a.m., the house came alive. Doors creaked open and slammed shut, the lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. James and Margaret rushed to the nursery, finding Oliver unharmed but wide awake, crying in distress. The shadowy figure from before had returned, but this time it was clearer. Its form was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that burned with fury. The room filled with an overpowering sense of grief and rage as the figure extended a hand toward James. "Why did you leave me?" the spirit bellowed, its voice reverberating through the walls. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We haven't left you. We found you, Jonas. We know your name. We know your pain." The figure hesitated, its edges flickering. James swallowed hard and stepped closer. "You were abandoned, and that wasn't right. But you're not forgotten anymore. We'll make sure the world remembers you." The shadow's anger seemed to waver, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving behind an overwhelming silence. That night, Clara prepared the ritual. She lit candles and burned sage, instructing James and Margaret to stay close to Oliver. Storm stayed by Clara's side, growling softly as she began to chant. As the ritual progressed, the house erupted in chaos. Doors slammed, windows rattled, and the lights flickered wildly. A deafening roar filled the air, and a dark figure materialized in the nursery, its form twisted and flickering like a broken shadow. "Why did you leave me?" the spirit bellowed, its voice shaking the walls. Clara stood firm. "You are not forgotten," she said. "Your suffering ends here. Go to your rest." James joined her, holding the miner's helmet and shouting, "We remember you. You're not alone anymore." The spirit hesitated, its form flickering. Slowly, it began to dissipate, its anger replaced with a haunting sadness. Then, it was gone. The house fell silent, the air lighter than it had been in weeks. Clara confirmed that the spirit had moved on, its lingering anger finally quelled. James and Margaret buried the bones alongside the wooden box, creating a small memorial for the miners who had died in the collapse. They vowed to teach Oliver about the history of their home, ensuring the miners' stories would never be forgotten. Storm, ever the vigilant protector, seemed at ease for the first time. He no longer growled at shadows or barked in the night. Instead, he spent his days happily following Oliver around the yard, his tail wagging with every step. Chapter 10, a new chapter. Months later, life had returned to normal. Oliver celebrated his first birthday, surrounded by family and friends. As the guests left and the house grew quiet, James and Margaret stood on the porch, watching the sunset. "Do you think it's over?" Margaret asked. James nodded. "I think so. And I think we owe it all to Storm." As if on cue, Storm trotted up, dropping a ball at James's feet. James laughed, ruffling the dog's fur. "Good boy," he said. From the nursery, Oliver's laughter rang out, filling the house with warmth. Whatever had haunted their home was gone, but the memory of those who had suffered would live on in their hearts. Storm wagged his tail, his job as the family's protector far from over.